Sign me up for the Christian Jubilee and write my name on the roll. I've been changed since the Lord has lifted me. I'm gonna be ready, ready, ready when Jesus comes. Sign me up for the Christian Jubilee and write my name on the roll. I've been changed since the Lord has lifted me. I'm gonna be ready, ready, ready when Jesus comes. I'm gonna be ready, ready, ready when Jesus comes.
Colossians 1 through 14, 9 through 14. For this reason we also, since the day we heard it, do not cease to pray for you, and ask that you may be filled with the knowledge of His will and all wisdom and spiritual understanding, that you may walk worthy of the Lord, fully pleasing Him, being fruitful in every good work and increasing in the knowledge of God, strengthened with all might according to His glorious power for all patience and long suffering with joy, giving thanks to the Father who has qualified us to be partakers of the inheritance, us to be partakers, since He delivered us from power of darkness and translate us into the kingdom of the Son of His love.
Lord, I lift your name on high. Lord, I love to sing your praises. I'm so glad you're in my life. I'm so glad you came to save us. You came from heaven to earth to show the way, from the earth to the cross, my debt to pay, from the cross to the grave, from the grave to the sky. Lord, I lift your name on high. Lord, I lift your name on high. Lord, love to sing your praises. I'm so glad you're in my life. I'm so glad you came to save us. You came from heaven to earth to show the way, from the earth to the cross, my debt to pay, from the cross to the grave, from the grave to the sky. Lord, I lift your name on high. You came from heaven to earth to show the way, from the earth to the cross, my debt to pay, from the cross to the grave, from the grave to the sky. Lord, I lift your name on high. Lord, I lift your name on high. Lord, I lift your name on high. Hungry I come to you, for I know you satisfy. I am empty, but I know your love does not run dry. So I wait for you, so I wait for you. I'm falling on my knees, offering all of me. Jesus, you're all this heart is living for. Broken, I run to you, for your arms are open wide. I am weary, but I know your touch restores all life. So I wait for you, and I wait for you. I'm falling on my knees, offering all of me. Jesus, you're all this heart is living for. Hungry, I run to you, for I know you satisfy. When I survey the wondrous cross on which the Prince of Glory died, my richest gain I count but loss, and pour contempt on all my pride. Forbid it, Lord, that I should boast, safe in the death of Christ my Lord. All the vain things that charm me most, I sacrifice them to his blood. See from his hand, his hands, his feet, sorrow and love flow mingle down. Did e'er such love and sorrow me, or thorns compose so rich a crown? Were the whole realm of nature mine, that were a present far too small. Love so amazing, so divine, demands my soul, my life, my all. Onward, Christian soldiers, marching on to war, with the cross of Jesus flowing on before. Christ the royal master leads against the foe, forward into battle, see his banners go. Onward, Christian soldiers, marching as to war,
You know, most of us, I think probably all of us, we just want to live our lives peacefully, take care of our responsibilities, enjoy our families, and have fun occasionally. And we don't want to cause trouble for anybody. We want to be good neighbors. We pay our taxes, keep out of trouble, you know. We think it'll be fine. A lady named Esther DiNardo in New York City was the same way. September 10th, 2001 was her birthday, and her daughter, who worked at the World Trade Center, took her to Windows of the World restaurant, which is on the upper floors of the North Tower. And she said it was beautiful. You can see Manhattan from there, all of Manhattan. And Esther never realized that that would be the last time she would spend any time with her daughter, because her daughter went to work the next day as usual and died when the airplane crashed into her place of work. Neither Esther nor her daughter Marissa were aware that they had an enemy that they didn't know about and that did not know them. And you know, I thought about that as I was reading Ephesians chapter 6, verses 10 to 13 this week, because the Apostle Paul is giving a warning to his readers, the church in Ephesus. And he is alerting them to the fact that they have an enemy that they can't see, that they may not even be aware of. And he wants them to be prepared. And so let's take a look at these verses together and think it through. Finally, be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. Put on the full armor of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Therefore, put on the full armor of God so that when the day of evil comes, you may be able to stand your ground, and after you've done everything, to stand. And so we have an enemy. The word devil is not actually a name, it's a description, and it means slanderer, accuser. The Greek word is diabolos, and it means a false accuser. Apparently in secular Greek, it even was used for what we would say backbiter. Someone who constantly throws bad news about a person and creates a bad reputation for them. That's his nature. The Apostle Paul, in the text we read, says that he uses schemes to attack. He deceives and entices and lures us into sin and destructive behavior. Our first introduction to him confirms that description. It's in Genesis chapter 3, a familiar story. Now the serpent was more crafty than any of the wild animals. Crafty, he's called in this translation. Than any of the wild animals the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, "Did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden?" Well, that's not what God had said. God had said, you can eat from all the trees in the garden except for one. And so he was misrepresenting God, lying about what God said, trying to twist Eve's mind up and deceive her and entice both Eve and her husband Adam to rebel against their father, with whom they had a wonderful, natural, close relationship on a daily basis, apparently. This pattern of lies and deceit and slander continues. Remember in Job chapter 1, that somewhat disturbing book of the Old Testament? God is pointing out Job's faithfulness. He says he is blameless. Imagine having this said about you. And God is saying this about Job. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil. He's saying, he's the man. This person represents the best of humanity. And what does Satan say? He says, does Job fear God for nothing? What he means is, the only reason he trusts you is because you're so good to him. If you take away those benefits, he's going to curse you. So God says, here's a good person. And the enemy says, no, his motives aren't pure. See, that's the way he works. Zechariah, the minor prophet Zechariah, has an interesting statement in chapter 3. It is Zechariah's prophetic vision. And in this vision, he sees Joshua, the high priest at that time, and Satan standing at his right hand to accuse him. See, he's the accuser. God, by the way, rebukes Satan in that context. In Revelation chapter 10, we see the beginning of the end of the enemy. Now have come the salvation, the power, and the kingdom of our God, and the authority of his Christ, for the accuser of our brothers, that's the devil, who accuses them before our God day and night, has been hurled down. Here's the scene. The devil accuses us, and God says, I love them. I died for them to pay for their sins. The devil says, they're not worth it. And God says, they're worth the price of my son. And the devil says, they will never live up to your expectations. And he says, I've already paid for my expectations. And I love them. Jesus gets very blunt at times. And in John chapter 8, he speaks of the devil's lies, and he exposes people who become willing allies of the devil. Maybe unintentionally at times, but nevertheless. Now that seems contradictory, doesn't it? Saying that they're willing and yet unintentional. But they obviously are cooperating fully with the devil. Well, let me just read this to you and you'll see what I'm talking about. He's talking to unbelieving Jews. He's talking to especially the Jewish establishment, the religious establishment, the elders, the ruling council, the Sanhedrin, the Pharisees, the conservative Jewish scholars, and the Sadducees, the liberal Jewish scholars. He's talking to this category of people. And he says, you belong to your father, the devil, and you want to carry out your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning, not holding to the truth, for there is no truth in him. And I like this phrase, what Jesus says. He says, when he lies, he speaks his native language, for he is a liar and the father of lies. Oh, he nailed it there. Now, did he hate these people? He obviously wasn't holding back when he said this. No. He doesn't hate them, but he knows who the real enemy is. And he wants to shake them to their realizing it as well. He didn't wish them harm, but he knew that they were deceived and they were cooperating with the deceiver. And he wanted to save them. Here's the thing. Do we really think that our first line of defense is destroying the devil's victims? Because his victims are the ones that we see as our enemies in this world. Do we really think that if we only just got the right president or the right Congress or the right teachers or the right coaches or the right principals, if we just lived in the right neighborhood, If we just got the right job at the right company that treated us right, then everything would be okay. If our eyes are really open, then we will see that many people in our world have been deceived by the enemy, and we will do what we can to open their eyes, to expose the lies. And yet, if we focus on the people, we can be so distracted from the truth that we neglect the cause of our problems. Remember what Paul wrote in that opening text? He says, our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, authorities, powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. That's the location of it. He says, there is a world that our eyes cannot see, and that is where the real war is going on. And that's why he tells us to fight it with the most powerful weapons we can find. For example, he says this in Luke chapter 6. Love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you. Now, that's not the weapons we're expecting, is it? Here's a battle plan for fighting the real enemy, for winning the war. First of all, live in the truth. Know it, tell it, and believe only what is true. Make sure you test what you accept as true. And how can you test it? Generally the way we do it is this. If you agree with me, then you're telling the truth. If you disagree with me, then you're a liar, right? And so we choose the news networks we watch based on how it lines up with that. Isn't that true? Generally speaking. We choose the people we associate with based on, if you agree with me, then you're a truth teller. If you don't, then you're a liar. I suggest a better standard than that. To the church in Thessalonica, Paul says, test everything. Hold on to the good, avoid every kind of evil. Well, how do you test it? In medical labs, the way you calibrate things and the way you certify a lab is you have a known quantity and you test against that. You know what the results of the known substance is. When you check weights and measures, for example, part of the job of the county auditor is to check weights. And so, have you ever seen them check the accuracy of gas station pumps? They have to do it on a regular basis. And you've seen the little sticker that certifies it, haven't you? Well, they bring a container. I don't know what the size is, probably a gallon. It's exactly a gallon. They know exactly a gallon, and they pump exactly a gallon into it. And if it doesn't come out right, they know this thing is off. If it's exactly a gallon, they can certify it as being accurate. Now, why is that important? I think you know, don't you? Because what if it's 10% off? You probably wouldn't notice it when you pump your gas, and yet that's a big zing. And so, anymore, it's a fortune. So it's important. So you need to have the right test. And so we have a standard. When Jesus in John 17 says to the Father, he says, protect them, make them holy, make them set apart. In other words, sanctify them by the truth. Then he tells us what truth is. He says, your word is truth. I believe what God says. Everything else I'm a little skeptical on, even myself. I believe what God says. So what we need to do is open the book, read it, hear what it says, learn to look at it objectively, because we can also look at it with bias, but test everything by the worldview that God presents to us and by what he says is true. That's how you become discerning. And this is a standard that we are gifted with. So it's important, first of all, that you accept the truth that the Scripture is the Word of God. Battle plan point number 2 is protect yourself and those you love. And how do you do that? Well, once again, back to our text, Paul says, therefore, put on the full armor of God so that when the day of evil comes, you may be able to stand your ground, and after you have done everything to stand. If you'll read a little further, you'll find a description of this armor of God that he's talking about. And of course, the illustration would be like a Roman soldier and the gear the kit that he wears. And, he talks about the utility belt and the body armor and the boots and the shield and the helmet and the weapon that you need for battle. Each piece of that equipment leads you to a closer walk with Christ, to a more obedient life of faith, to growth in character and integrity, to more love for God and your fellow mankind. That's what the armor of God is about. So, if you feel unprotected and unsafe in this world, that's the first thing to go to. We can live with an illusion of protection, or we can actually focus on what is going to truly protect us. And then he says, pray. And then pray some more, and then pray some more. If the war really is spiritual, and it is, if defeating the obvious enemy is just an illusion, and it is, then we need to fight the battle where it actually is taking place. Look at what he says here a few verses after what we read. He says, and pray in the Spirit on all occasions, with all kinds of prayers and requests. With this in mind, be alert and always keep on praying for all the saints. You see, he says pray, and then pray some more. All kinds of prayers for everything, and especially remember to pray for God's people. Now, we're pretty sure that Paul was sitting in jail when he wrote Ephesians. Not because he'd done something wrong, but because he'd done something right. And he doesn't say, and when you send a cake to me, put a hacksaw blade in it. He doesn't say, could maybe you do it like they used to do in the old Westerns? You know, I used to love it when they did that. They'd tie a rope to the bars in the windows and pull it with a horse and just pulls the whole wall out and the guy escapes. That's not what he's asking for. In fact, I think it was last week we talked about Paul ended up appealing to Caesar, and it took him to Rome. He's still in jail. He ends up being under house arrest, guarded by Praetorian guards that came from the palace, which he taught the gospel, and many of them became Christians. But in God's sovereign manipulation of this, he was able to have people come to his home while he's under house arrest. I think he had one of those GPS monitors on his ankle and was able to stay home. And he taught about Jesus to these people. And so here is Paul, strategically located in Rome, doing mission work in Rome while incarcerated. You'd almost think that God arranged that, wouldn't you? Because he did. And so he says, pray and pray and pray, because this is where the war is won. The war we see is driven by the war we cannot see. And we can hold back the enemy through prayer when we engage with God in the battle. Let me tell you what stimulated my thoughts to bring this message today. I pulled into one of my favorite places a couple of times over a couple of weeks, and I ended up parking behind a car. And in the top right corner, actually the lower left corner of his back window was a pentagram. And there were a few other symbols, and then up in the upper corner was Hail Satan. And when I went into the business, I could immediately tell whose car it was because he had tattoos that matched his back window. So I immediately went over and I dumped a gallon of communion juice on his head. No, that wouldn't do it. You know, my first instinct was, I don't want to go in there. This place is contaminated. My second instinct was to think, that guy's my enemy. And then as I thought it through a little bit more, I thought, no, this guy's just like me, except for a slightly different path in life. He's a victim of the enemy. He's not my enemy. He's my neighbor. How am I to treat him? What would Jesus do? Love your enemies. Pray for those who misuse you. Serve them. Care for them. Bless them. I haven't gotten to know him yet, but I intend to. You see, your enemy is not the guy with the pentagram on his back window. Your enemy is not the neighbor with the Trump 2024 sign in their yard, nor is it the neighbor down the street that's still got the Biden-Harris sign in his yard. Your enemy is somebody else who is stirring things up, who is trying to make us look at each other with savage eyes instead of saying, how can I love you the way Jesus loves me? How can I be an agent to let God transform us both into what He wants us to be? Am I suggesting that there's not a lot of lies and misinformation out there? I'm not suggesting that. I just want you to know where it's coming from, ultimately. And remember who the real enemy is. So when you start seething with anger to the latest nonsense that comes out of D.C., start praying for those who are deceived. Pray for yourself that your heart will be controlled by Christ. Imagine if our first century brothers or sisters allowed the situation that they were living under to control them and dominate them. It would be the same as It would be the same as if, I don't know, maybe Putin riding on the back of a horse came riding into the U.S. and took over Conneaut, Ohio, and said, "You're going to do what I say and pay taxes to me." Because that's what it was like living under a Roman emperor who was being convinced that he was actually a deity himself. And that not only do you pay taxes to me, but you bow down and worship me. And if you don't, you're going to pay a consequence for it. Imagine living under that and what it could do to your mind. It could make you fearful all the time. It could make you so defiant that you would do something irrational. And so instructions like this are given. Remember who the real enemy is. Remember who the one who really is in ultimate control is. And put yourself in his hands. And look at what God did. It took a little time, but ultimately, Caesar fell. The one opposed to the church fell, and the church became dominant and became the dominant power in that society. It's time for prayer and to know who the real enemy is.
He signed my deed with his atoning blood. He ever lives to make his promise good. Though all the hosts of hell march in to make a second claim, they all march out at the mention of his name. They all march out at the mention of his name. They all march out at the mention of his name. He signed my deed with his atoning blood. He ever lives to make his promise good. Though all the hosts of hell march in to make a second claim, they all march out at the mention of his name. They all march out at the mention of his name. They all march out at the mention of his name. Jesus.